Okay, we will start the second day of the program. Today we have main professor, Dr. Joseph Zompetti. I probably can call Joe. Well, it seems the Jake and Shana are calling him Dr. Z.
It's even shortened now to just Z.
Z.
Yeah.
So Professor Zompetti, so start with Z, so just Z maybe. He's not in the best his condition, so I will introduce him first, and then most of the lectures and the activities will be taken care of by Shana and Jake, like yesterday. And I think you have had heavy reading, and you may have some questions that you can really ask. So don't hesitate. Your English is okay. We make mistakes. Native speakers of English often make mistakes, and they can't get 100% score on their graduate school's English test. That's what I heard. So don't worry.
Ohayou gozaimasu. I want to first apologize for missing yesterday. I don't know how much they told you, but I had to go to the hospital yesterday. I'm feeling better today, but still not 100%. So I am here to help. So when you have questions or the exercises, if you need additional clarification or additional explanation for any of the ideas or concepts, I will be here and I will help. Okay, and I just want to echo what Professor Inouye said, and that is, please ask us questions. Okay, we are here to help you, and we don't always know what's going on in your head. So, and certainly, please speak up. I guarantee you that your English is better than my Japanese. Okay, so
How much can you speak Japanese?
maybe 20 words. Okay, so
19 more than I've got.
so please don't be afraid to ask questions. Okay, so it's my great pleasure and honor to be here. I've been here before, and I always enjoy working with Japanese students, and from Kazakhstan, right?
Yes.
Terrific. All right. Okay. Well, I think we should just go ahead and get started then. You may want to start with what questions
Yeah.
do you have, right? The readings and so forth.
So that's how we wanted to start today. We're just going to go back over really quickly the major issues that we covered yesterday. So yesterday we talked about why we debate. We introduced the idea of a topic and having a resolution, the idea of an affirmative and a negative team. We talked to you about different stock issues. So, that a plan from the affirmative team needs to prove that it can solve some type of significant harm, right? We also discussed the different elements of an argument. So we went over claims, evidence, and warrants. So any of these things that we talked about yesterday.
So let's break it down into smaller parts, because that is a very long sentence. So the authors say, we will argue that rationality is best viewed as an emergent and interpretive process involving interpretation and negotiation by and among actors. Okay, so what's rationality? What's a good other word for rationality?
Reasoning,
Yeah.
thinking.
What they're saying is the authors of the article are going to be using the reasoning and warrants, like we talked about, to be able to look at the issue of GMOs, and that you're going to have to use those reasoning skills to look at both the good and the bad about the GMOs, and that they're going to present both sides of the argument. And let's see, and then the second half is that that conventions which may be taken for granted are nevertheless unstable and mutable depending on the nature of the interactions among actors and also depending on the institutional, technical, legal, and material arrangements that surround GMOs at a given time and place. Do you want to take that out of the
Yes. So, there's a lot, like Shannon said, there's a lot going on in this chunk of the sentence. But what the authors are trying to tell you is that there are a lot of different elements surrounding the GMO debate. So many different factors that are involved. Things like treaties, things like the TPP, things like different negotiations between countries or laws that Japan has in place. That people just, when they are thinking of the debate surrounding GMOs, people just accept these different factors as permanent, that these factors just exist, and that there's nothing that can be done to change them.
And depending on which way you look at it, depending on who you are, will depend on which part of the GMO discussion you focus on, and you'll ignore other parts of the GMOs. So if you're a health organization, for example, you may focus on how GMOs can be bad for your health and not look at how they can possibly grow a lot more food for a growing world population. So you look at one thing but ignore other things in the discussion depending on who you are.
So with this whole sentence, what the authors are trying to explain is that because of these different elements that we tend to, when we look at them, we tend to ignore certain elements and focus on others. Or there are different laws that we just assume are true, that isn't the way things really are about GMOs. The way we come to understand GMOs is constantly changing. And that's why we have different forms of, that's one of the reasons we wanted you to read this article, is because it fits in perfectly with debate. For the reason that this is something that we can talk about, something that we can challenge these assumptions that we have about GMOs and discuss how our relationship with GMOs could change, how these laws could change that we have been taking for granted.
I'd add just one more quick thing, and that is that the science is changing all the time.
Yes.
So when we talk about whether or not GMOs are harmful to our bodies, there's still studies being done right now. So we don't necessarily have all of the facts yet in certain arguments. So that's why we have to, as these authors suggest, we have to look at this topic and be open to the probability, to the possibility that arguments can change.
I believe, Koki, is that correct? I'm trying your names, I promise I'm working on them. He did some outside research on his own, and he found that biologists will test things for a long time before they decide if it's good or bad, but with GMOs, we haven't had them long enough to really establish. So that's another reason we have to be able to keep our minds open to any possibility that a GMO could be.
So something that might help out is, if you remember when Shannon and I first came in here yesterday, we talked about why we debate and what debate is. And after talking with you all, we discovered that we debate because we are constantly looking for the best possible option, the best course of action, whether that means policies or if you are deciding what you and your friends ought to do with your evening. You are discussing different options of what you could do to try and find what would be the most fun, right? Just like with GMOs, these authors are encouraging debate and discussion so that we can figure out the best course of action with how we want to adapt our societies to deal with things like GMOs. So we are on page 75, and at the bottom of that first paragraph there, we want to start at, in other words, the tacit and routinized understanding within Japanese society defers final decisions and activities related to agricultural research and development to the public sector. Although content analysis of newspaper articles suggests that civic concerns and justification became prominent, especially in and around 2000, the government has maintained a strong presence in the Japanese GMO discourse. So we'll take it sentence by sentence. The first sentence says, I'll just repeat it again. In other words, the tacit and routinized understanding within Japanese society defers final decisions and activities related to agricultural research and development to the public sector. So what this sentence is saying is that even though there are a lot of privately owned companies that might research GMOs, have something to do with GMOs, when it comes to the actual citizens of Japan, citizens look to what the government has to say about GMOs when they're trying to decide how they feel about GMOs, when they're trying to make their own opinions. They defer to the Japanese government. The next sentence says that although content analysis of newspaper articles suggests that civic concerns and justifications became prominent, especially in and around 2000, the government has maintained a strong presence in the Japanese GMO discourse. So, what that's saying is that within newspapers, we can see that these private concerns are becoming are more heard among Japanese citizens since the year 2000. However, at the point that this article was written, the government's stance was still the most important.
So they're making their own opinions, but those opinions are being based on what the government says about the GMOs. So Japanese citizens, so those of you that live here, I do not, so you, it's saying individuals like you look to what the government says of if the GMOs are safe or if they're not safe, if you should eat or buy them or if you should not eat or buy them. Rather than trying to make their own decision, they rely on those people that have the expertise and the knowledge. So the Japanese people will have the people that study GMOs in the government dictate or tell them if GMOs are safe or not safe, instead of forming their own opinion and deciding for themselves. They rely on people that study it a lot and understand it more so than you or I could, because we don't work with GMOs. It's saying that the newspapers use what the government says to help write the story for people to read. So
Similar
it's
things happened in the nuclear accident.
Mhm.
The government reports were without much criticism relayed by the media.
yes.
And then they found out later that they weren't telling everything.
But yeah, so exactly, you were correct. The government and the media work together in Japan to tell people about the GMOs.
So, last session, we talked to you about the idea of harms, right, for stock issues. So an affirmative team tries to prove that there's a problem with the status quo that they need to solve. The negative team, on the other hand, tries to say that by implementing that plan, the affirmative team will cause something bad to happen. Sound familiar? Okay, this is called a disadvantage. So what you are looking at is the impact to a disadvantage. And by impact, we mean what is the bad thing that's going to happen as a result of implementing the plan. So what this disadvantage says is that right now, Prime Minister Abe, his political popularity is decreasing. People are starting to like him less and less. But the plan is very popular among the Japanese public. A lot of people want to prohibit the import, the sales, the production of GMOs. So if this happens while Prime Minister Abe is in power, then he will get a boost in popularity. Okay, with me so far? So that piece of evidence says that if Prime Minister Abe becomes very popular in the next few months, he is going to pursue collective security. He's going to repeal Article 9 from the Japanese Constitution, and be able to construct a military. So that piece of evidence says that if that happens, relations between Japan and China and South Korea will be destroyed. There will be no positive relationship anymore if that happens. Okay? Do you see how that story makes sense? How those elements build off of each other? So, while that piece of evidence by itself does not relate to GMOs, it, like a lot of the arguments we use in debate, works as part of a story. A lot of debate is telling a story about what is going to happen if this plan, this policy does happen or doesn't happen. So this is just the ending of a story. Think of it like that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. That's a tricky, most people don't understand what the concept of soft power is. It's a very tricky concept, okay? So, think of it like this. When a country in the world has power among the international community, when other countries respect that country, that can happen through one of two ways. The first way is if that country is very wealthy and trades a lot, or has a very strong military. That is one way that the country can get that power. That's called hard power, because those are, physical means that a country can use to gain power. Then there's this idea of soft power. Soft power is essentially being friendly, being a diplomatic leader with other countries, taking stances on particular issues. So you'll see in some of the articles that you read, or maybe more specifically some of the evidence that you've seen within the articles, that as far as the GMO issue is concerned, Japan is definitely a leader in the international community. A lot of countries look to the stances that Japan takes on GMOs to determine how they feel that they should act. So this argument is saying that if Japan does our plan, follows the resolution, and bans GMOs, that they are going to get a lot of soft power because other countries will respect that move from Japan. Japan can then use this soft power to increase its relationships, improve its relationships with other countries.
You can think about it with a great way to think about hard power is think about a playground and little kids. Soft power is that little kid that can convince the other kids to have fun with them just by being nice and doing things that other kids like to do, okay? Hard power is the bully, is that little kid that will intimidate you and scare you and force you to do what they want you to do because they're bigger than you. So what we're saying is through soft power, Japan is able to be that nice kid, the nice one that everyone wants to do what Japan does and work with Japan because they're not trying to force anyone to do anything with a military.
Right.
Does that help make sense? Okay.
So what this piece of evidence specifically says is that when a country has a lot of this soft power, they can convince other countries to work with them. They can convince other countries to cooperate and together come up with solutions to diseases, come up with technological innovations that would make the world a better place. But without soft power, countries can't cooperate in this way. So this is the opposite of a disadvantage. This is called an advantage. Okay. So with the disadvantage, that story about Prime Minister Abe, we talked about how right now Prime Minister Abe doesn't have the popularity, but if the plan passes, he will have popularity enough to do something that would cause a bad thing to happen, right? With this, you have a story where Japan, by doing the plan, can increase its soft power, and as a result, something good will happen. So this is an argument for the affirmative called an advantage. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. I can tell you that this is the difficult part of I can't take
You're
it ahead of
fine.
time.
I know how to do it.
Okay. This is the difficult part of doing policy debate research, no matter what language you are looking at, is that often when you are getting into the science of things, so if you have a topic like GMOs Or for example, last year I did research for a topic about renewable energy sources. So a lot of terminology, a lot of jargon that doesn't make sense at first because you don't have that familiarity. So what we saw in those articles are just specific scientific terms that are related to the idea of GMOs. So the best thing to do is to look those words up and see if you can make sense of them in the articles. So one of them is transgenesis, or the transfer of cloned genes to another breed or species.
So that's when we take a GMO and something that we've changed in that plant through science, however that's done, will change things. So it's gene transfer. It's when it goes from one. So when a gene that's been altered goes from one plant to another plant.
What often happens with GMOs is if a farmer plants, let's say, corn, and it's a genetically modified organism, when after the harvest, the seeds from the corn can get blown over into another person's land, or it can be carried through a river, and so those genetically altered seeds can then disturb a population of other plants or organisms. And so that's what transgenesis means, where genes from one organism that's already been altered somehow finds its way to another organism.
Really, and Shanna's looking up the more specific definitions for each of these terms now, but for the purposes of the article here, what you generally need to know about the terms is that these are different techniques that scientists use to genetically modify food or genetically modify crops. So different ways that we transfer genes, or different ways that we might alter genes in order to create a GMO.
Okay, so cisgenesis, what that is that's just how in the science world we call them it's the science term for that it's been genetically modified. It's just how we tell that it's not a natural plant, but one that we've done something to it. That's all that word means. It's very long for no reason. And then, so this is when there's something very specific they change about the plant, where they go in and find that tiny gene and they change it somehow. How that happens, couldn't tell you. But that's what it means. I don't think any of these words are in any of the evidence you have to read, or that you have to read, so.
And again, like I
Yeah.
like obviously, we just had to look these words up with you. We didn't know what they meant either. So again, this is often the tricky part about doing research for policy debate is once you get into the most credible types of sources, journal articles or policy briefs, you come across this kind of language. The trick is to look up what you need to know in order to understand the article as a whole. What is ultimately this article trying to explain about the policy world? How does it relate to our arguments as we're trying to craft them? Okay. So if there is a particular term that you don't understand in its specifics, but you can understand the article overall and know what it's saying to you, you are probably in good shape. Okay?
This one was, I think that article wasn't quite so tiny. Oh yeah, this article, all you really needed to get out of this one was that GMOs can affect the environment and can affect people. That is all. Lots of words to learn that.
Yeah, one thing about the reading, if you have a massive reading like this, you don't need to read everything. For example, the first question Sweden asked about the long sentence.
Yeah.
It's in the introduction of the article, and usually toward the end of the introduction, as you learned in writing class, articles have this is statement or preview of the contents. And that long sentence exactly does that. It announces the preview of the contents to follow. And also, in reading, you don't need to look up all the words you don't understand. Sometimes definition is given near the phrase. For example, that transgenesis, look at page 22 of the article package, and in the abstract, line 5, genetic modification of genome uses techniques like site-directed mutagenesis, selective breeding, chronicle variations, horizontal gene transfer, in the parentheses, transgenesis. So transgenesis is horizontal gene transfer, whatever it is. So these different techniques, so all you should know at this point is there are different ways to do genetic modification.
Yes.
I went through the first article about the approval process of GMOs.
Yes.
And personally, I have some question that there were some figures during the in the article, and like process of going through the ministries and so on. Personally, I couldn't catch what would be useful in making constructive states. So if you can please explain.
Jake and I were talking about this yesterday about how those pictures don't help at all. They are horrible.
Right. The best thing that you can get out of looking at those figures, those models and flowcharts, is that the approval process for GMOs in Japan is very extensive and very thorough. Takes a long time. The article, very complicated. The article talks about how for just one particular GMO crop, it took 10 years for it to get through, right? So,
If you look at the case, so the affirmative evidence, and you look at,
No, sorry.
it was up there. Look at solvency. What that tells you in the evidence packet, one second, we'll put it back up.
Evidence?
Yeah, the one that was up. Yep, that one. These two cards, basically, that's what you need to know. That the Ministry of the Environment does whatever type 1 cases are, and then the Minister of Health and Wellness and the Minister of Agriculture, I don't remember what FF is.
Forestries and
There it
fisheries.
is, Forestries and Fish and Labor and Welfare. They are in charge of what is actually sold in the stores. The second one is where how the GMOs have to be labeled when they're in stores, and the different laws that regard that, and if it's safe to be grown in stores. And the case type 1 is if they're allowed to grow anything in the United States. So that's a long article to say this.
there's something else that you said that I think we should expand upon. Now, you said that you weren't sure how you could incorporate these materials into a constructive speech, right? Often, when you are doing research for your topic, trying to build an argument, you will come across articles that give lots of good background information, but in terms of trying to find a good piece of evidence for you to put in your speech, they don't have like those cards that we were talking about. They might not have a good card for you in that article. It will give you lots of good background understanding for you to walk in and better understand the topic. But in terms of actually constructing a specific piece of evidence, it might not have anything for you. So this is why when you are first starting out researching a topic, you come to articles like this so that you can get that richer understanding and better search for those more specific pieces of evidence.
think about it for cross-examination. Remember how we told you that cross-ex is that time where you get to ask questions to understand things? This could be a question as a negative team that you could ask. How are GMOs approved? What steps do they go through? And having read this article, you could, say, well, this is how, and you wouldn't have to look back at your evidence and just reread what your evidence says, but you can look really smart, and I've done all my research more than you, and use the articles that way.
And there's something else. When you read articles like this that might not necessarily give you a good card or a good argument, really what they're meant to help you do is brainstorm better ideas for evidence. So for example, this article walks you through that very extensive and complicated process for GMO approval, right? Well, the article doesn't talk about this, but if you think about it, well, gee, there are so many steps and procedures and years that this goes through. The approval of GMOs probably represents a lot of jobs and a lot of work, right? So if we ban GMOs and this approval process doesn't work anymore, there are probably a lot of people who now don't have a job. So let's research that. Okay. So use articles like this to try and think about, to try and drive your thinking towards debate-style arguments. Now, and on the other side of that, for example, if you go to page 7 of that article, of the packet.
Yeah.
Right. Are you all with me? If you look at that first full paragraph, starting with the key findings.
I need that.
7.
146.
146, sorry.
No, you're
So we'll pull it up here. Okay, starting here, the key findings, and you read these 2 paragraphs, or I'm sorry, these 3. This whole block, this whole section talks about how long it takes to approve GMOs and how much money it costs. So if I'm on the negative, I'm thinking, again, that's a lot of jobs that would be lost if the plan got rid of this process. But from the affirmative side of things, I'm thinking, if we banned GMOs, look how much money and time we are going to save taxpayers and the government, so we can use those funds for something else. Okay. So again, these types of articles are the perfect way to get you started on finding more specific arguments.
And again, you don't need to read through the article. Frankly speaking, I must confess I didn't read the article, and I started looking at the abstract, and then went through the labels, the headlines. Then I found the label time and cost of GMO approval, page 6 of the package, article package. Okay, this must be something. And then I get into the contents to read and find the cost and time.
learning to skim or only read bits and pieces will quickly become your best friend, not only in debate, but in college in general. You can get through a lot more information than if you sit and read every single word. Dr. Zampetti loves to assign us, because we are in his classes, loves to assign us a lot of reading. By a lot, I mean whole books. And don't tell him, I don't read every word. But don't let him know that. Shush. I read some words. So skimming is fantastic. It's the only thing that has saved my brain from exploding.
Yes, abstracts are very helpful because they, the professor in a way said, they preview the entire article for you. They often will offer definitions for the trickier terms. I also find it helpful that, a lot of articles, I usually read the abstract to see where the article's going, look at the labels and the headings, and then skip down to the conclusion section to see ultimately what is the argument that they make through this article. If it's an argument that I think I can use somehow, I will scroll back up and find it within the more detailed explanation of it within the article. If their argument isn't something that's useful, I move on.
This is a good segue into using stock issues to locate arguments. Stock issues are not only important for the affirmative to meet their burden of proof, which you talked about yesterday, but stock issues can also be used as a tool for discovering arguments. So in other words, if you know that you have to look for harms, you have to look for some way to solve, and that's if you're affirmative. Of course, if you're negative, you need answers to all of those. So you can quickly go through some of these articles and say, this person's talking about a way to solve this problem. That might be good affirmative solvency evidence. Or, this person's answering all of the reasons why GMOs are bad. That might be good negative evidence. So we use the stock issues, and then of course, for both perspectives, affirmative and negative. So you're essentially looking up, I don't know which one you went over yesterday, but essentially you're looking up, the harms, the solvency, the advantages, and then on the negative, you have answers to solvency, answers to the harms and disadvantages. So you're looking at 6 different things when you're reading through these articles. So that's also another way you can quickly go through reading material, is because those stock issues essentially allow you to locate important segments of those articles that you can then use.
This article is what created the plan. This is how I learned, because I don't know a lot about how things work. I mean, I know how basically the United States government works, but not Japan's. So this is what allowed me to know, so this is who has control of GMOs. So these are obviously the organizations and the entities that will have to make the ruling on what we can and cannot do with GMOs. So it provided that first step, because before I knew how GMOs worked, I couldn't write anything. So it's a great way when you're first given a topic of figure out who controls that, and then use the stock issues from there to continue your research and go out.
I think that maybe the best example of this is that issue of solvency, when you were looking for a way for your, like Shanna said, she got her plan from this article. In the conclusion sections of articles like this, they often, when they make their arguments based on whatever they found, they will offer a solution or a policy. They will say, we did this analysis and we found all of these problems with Japan's GMO approval process, and we think that Japan's government really ought to do this, and they'll give you a plan. And you can use that to help guide you and write your plan, and use that article for your solvency evidence. So.
Right here. If you ever see this, great place to read. Because this little section will take the whole big article into like 2 or 3 paragraphs. So instead of 10 pages, 3 paragraphs. Yay!
Of course, the other thing too is that we wanted you to have these articles so that you understand the context of the debate. But the research has already been done. You have the evidence packet. Now that doesn't mean that you can't do more. Certainly you can go and locate more evidence yourselves. But for purposes of the workshop this week, you already have the evidence packet. So now these articles should help provide some context so that you can understand what the evidence means in more detail.
To help with cross-ex is a really good way to think about it. So you're not having to wonder what the answer is. You're just able to say it because you've already read it.